we're talking about, now that we're equipped with theodicies, we're talking about what's called the logical argument from evil. So this week we're going to look at the logical argument from evil. Next week we're going to look at what's called the evidential argument from evil. The difference is this. The logical argument from evil is what atheists say that it is logically impossible or logically incoherent that a God exists that is good and evil exists. The evidential argument is making a different argument, and it's saying that based on the evidence at hand, we can make a deduction that God does not exist. Okay, so they're a bit different. One's making a logical incoherence argument, and the other one is making a evidential argument. Does that make sense? Everyone tracking with the difference? Okay, cool. This is a little bit, we're now deeper in the weeds. Last week was like all free will, and we're discussing compatibilism, free will, determinism, and that was pretty hefty. So I don't know if some of you guys' brains were feeling a little mushy at the end of it all, but this week we're discussing this logical argument from evil. Luckily, I don't think this week is going to be overly complicated for you guys, because I think since we've discussed the laws of logic, we talked about how people ask incoherent questions about God, right? Like, can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? That's an incoherent thing. It's a logically contradictory thing. So remember, incoherent things are not things. So just because you have words put together does not mean it's a thing, right? Also, and when we say incoherent, did you like how I put incoherent? I forgot the E in there. Right. Incoherent. That actually does work, doesn't it? Yeah, that works. There's a certain irony there. For those who watch online, you guys can't tell, but I forgot the last E in incoherent on both of them. How did I manage that? Incoherent.
It looks good together, though.
It does look good. It looks good. And so if it's incoherent, it is logically contradictory. See, guys, there's a reason I'm a theology and philosophy guy. I am clearly not a grammar guy, or spelling, or educated. Anyway. All right.
Most philosophers aren't, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. So that is actually really funny. I look over, I'm like, how did I manage that? Anyway, so as we're looking at these arguments specifically, because now we want to look at what atheists are saying from evil disproves God in some sense, right? So we've already discussed, and can you see why, and I think it'll make more sense, but can you see why I took that much time to set that up? Because I wanted you guys to know what some of the Christian thoughts behind some of these things, some of the basic things that were coming up, how truth was measured, before we get into exactly what they're going to say. Because if you don't know when you get to exactly what they're going to say and you're not equipped, you might actually go, ooh, that might be a pretty good point, right? So I'm a teacher where I want to make sure that you guys feel like you have pretty good answers before we get into it, so that way you guys can instantly start red flagging the things that are coming up, okay? So, looking at the arguments from evil specifically, that's what we're doing now. We're looking at the arguments against God from evil. So, is an all-powerful and all-loving God incoherent in the face of suffering? So, again, incoherent is something that is logically contradictory. Notice how I put an E here properly? Isn't that nice? So if it's incoherent, it's logically contradictory. However, this is incoherent. So anyway, okay. All right, so things are incoherent that are incoherent are not true. Things are incoherent are not things. So the argument is making a strong statement, right? It is making a really strong statement that an all-powerful and all-loving God cannot exist in the face of so much suffering in the world. That's what they're saying, that it absolutely is incoherent. Does that make sense? So they're going, if God is all good, evil would not exist, period. It is logically contradictory. That's what they're trying to make a claim for. So this argument is making a stronger statement, but it's actually easier to defeat. Okay? So it's easier to defeat. So here's a summary. So, all right, yeah, I'll keep that up here and we'll keep rolling. Okay, so here's a summary. A logical argument from evil is not attempting to show that it is improbable that God exists. It is attempting to show that it is not possible that God exists as we define it today. So the argument is making a strong statement, but again, it's easier to defeat. You don't have to use a theodicy here, because remember I said theodicies are what a Christian actually thinks is the answer. And they're like a prepared, formal response, like the heaven theodicy, the free will theodicy, right? When it comes to the logical argument from evil, you don't need a theodicy. You can use a theodicy, but all you need is what we call a defeater. Okay? So there's a difference between a theodicy and a defeater, and we're going to go through that. So you don't have to have a theodicy to defeat the argument, just need a decent defeater. There is, so let me just quickly mention this. There's a difference between a defense and a theodicy, okay? A defense versus a theodicy, okay? So a theodicy, again, is what the Christian actually believes to be the answer, and a defense or defeater answers a logical argument that might be true, okay? So I'm going to give an example. Micah's not in here again. I wanted to pick on him. Dang it. I even had it written in here with his name. So anyway, so the defeater is a defense is that as long as it is possible that there's another answer, you can defeat the claim, right? Somebody's making a very strong claim. All you have to do is mention a possibility that could defeat said claim, right? So, Seth, I'm going to pick on you instead.
That's fine.
So, if it's fine. I've been bullied all my life. All right. So, if Seth came to church today, and he came to church today absolutely soaking wet, and an argument was postulated that the only logical way his clothes were so wet is that he jumped in the shower with his clothes on. Right? So would you say that that's a logical argument, that that's the only possibility? No, right? So all I have to do is, if you're going, nope, the only answer is that, all I have to do is offer a defeater. It doesn't have to be even what I think is the right answer, right? I can just say something to the effect of, well, maybe he walked in the rain. Maybe he fell into a pond. Maybe he got assaulted by a dolphin on his way to church. Who knows? But there are other answers than he jumped into the shower with his clothes on, right? And now, as silly as that is, but that I hope that silliness of that can kind of help you see what I'm saying. If someone's saying it's logically impossible for evil to exist and God to exist, then all you need is a possibility as to why evil would exist and God exist. Does that make sense? You don't have to even sneak and believe it. Just because all you have to do to show is that their logical argument or their logical claim isn't true and it doesn't hold up. Okay? Also, Jordan, you missed the funny part when I mentioned incoherence. I forgot the E in both of these when I wrote these on the whiteboard, the last E. So they're incoherent, which is hilarious. I looked over and I just was like, I misspelled that both times. I don't even... Anyway. Alrighty. You can definitely tell I woke up at 4 a.m. wide awake. So, alright. As long as any other explanation essentially is given or possible, then the claim fails. So this is what we call a philosophical defeater, okay? That is what this is called. So, sorry, I just want to make sure that I knew what the next slide was. A philosophical defeater is an answer to a logical argument that might even possibly be true, as long as one can imagine any possible explanation for why God might have created a world that could contain evil, then the logical argument fails. Am I making sense here? Okay, cool. So the argument is making a much stronger statement, but it is actually easily dismissed because there are many possible defeaters one can imagine, right? As to why evil would exist. So, atheist philosophers, this is what they have, these are atheist philosophers, by the way. This is what they have to say regarding the logical argument from evil. Actually, real quick, Bob, since you just walked in, I'm not to put you on the spot, but we are discussing, I just want to give you a review because we're about ready to get into a little bit more of the weeds here, so it might help. So essentially what we're saying is that there's a logical argument from evil atheists will make. What they're saying is that it is logically incoherent for a good God to exist and evil to exist. So if evil exists, God cannot exist. That's what their logical claim is. Okay? And of course, that's a pretty strong claim to say that if evil exists, God cannot exist. It's a very strong claim. So, but we don't need a theodicy like we've reviewed the last 2 weeks to defeat it. All we need is what we call a defeater, which is a possibility of something else. So an example that I used was Seth. If Seth walked into church and his clothes were soaking wet, then you postulated that well, the only reason why he's soaking wet is because he jumped in the shower with his clothes on. That's the only logical explanation. All I need to do is, I don't even have to say what I believe. I could just say, well, he could have fell in a pond, he could have walked in the rain. That's not the only answer. So them saying that there's no possible way evil exists and God exists is a strong claim, but it's easier to defeat because all we have to do is mention a possibility as to why. Does that make sense? So, okay, very different than an evidential argument, okay? But this is a logical argument. They're trying to say it's incoherent, and we've already discussed incoherency ad nauseum in this class, but it's important, okay? So now, this is what atheists have said regarding the logical argument from evil. Okay, so William Rowe, and I know you probably can't see all that from back there, but this is what it says. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. Remember, this is an atheist. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. Indeed, granted incompatibilism, there is a fairly compelling argument from the view that the existence of evil is logically consistent with the existence of a theistic God. So he's saying that people who make this, that it's logically impossible for God to exist and evil to exist, even the atheist William Rowe is saying, that is an extravagant claim that no one has ever succeeded in proving. Okay? He's like, because there's a lot of reasons, at the end, there's a lot of reasons that are logically consistent with the existence of a theistic God. So even atheists admit that the logical argument from evil isn't a good one. Okay? Because they realize that we have ways we could easily defeat that, right? I mean, you could even, I don't believe in the reformed theodicy, right? But I could easily go, well, God could have a purpose in the evil. And I could just quickly flip it out there, and now I've defeated the logical argument, right? It's because I gave a possibility, even though I don't believe it, right? Jordan, do you?
Can we at least point out that even the atheists know that compatibilism and libertarian free will are not possibilities?
Isn't that funny? Even they're like, hold on.
Even the atheists are like, no, those are entirely logically
inconsistent.
Yeah.
It is funny. That's what I mean, where it's like when you get into the actual, because William Rowe is actually a brilliant philosopher. Obviously, he's an atheist, so I disagree with him. But he's one of those, well, I appreciate his honesty. In many ways, where it's like if you listen to someone like Sam Harris, you get this idea. And have you guys ever heard Dr. Sam Harris?
I've heard of, yeah.
Okay, all right.
I listen to much of this stuff.
Okay, there's actually a pretty good debate with him and William Lane Craig to check out on morality. It's pretty good, but Dr. Sam Harris, he kind of is a continually moving ball because he has logically contradictory views, and he doesn't think he does, but he does. So it can be hard to pin him down. But it is funny because that's why I appreciate someone like William Rowe. But anyway, another atheist philosopher says this, and this is Michael Martin. Because of the failure of deductive arguments from evil, atheologians, which is a fancy word for atheists, have developed inductive or probabilistic arguments from evil for the non-existence of God. Because he's like, all right, because of the failure of deductive arguments from evil, so we can't use this logical argument from evil, right? We have developed what we say inductive or probabilistic arguments from evil for the non-existence of God. So he's basically said we've had to abandon the idea that God can't exist with evil. We've had to abandon this because it doesn't hold up. So now we have to just go for a probabilistic approach. Okay. Well,
Is that like evidence-based?
Yeah. So where they're going, well, based on X, Y, Z. Okay, these are the things that are claimed about God, and these are the things that we witness. It is a high probability that God does not exist, and that is the evidential argument from evil, which we will be actually digging into probably next week. Okay.
So it's like an N of one case, though. Like you only have one this to observe. So how can you deduct anything from it?
So that is one of the things where it's like, how do you deduct from that? This is the only universe you see, right? Like, how is it that you even make such measurements?
Yeah.
And that's what we're specifically going to be mentioning next week, especially, because that is a great question. How do we even measure such? At what point is there enough amount of evil where God can exist? Right? Like, okay, so we can allow this much, but that's too far. And then, it becomes very difficult to nail that down. So how do you even measure such, especially since we don't have multiple universes by which we can measure, right? So, anyhow, alrighty. So, Though the logical arguments from evil have been rejected by most atheist philosophers, it is alive and well amongst what we would call, it's kind of a dig, but internet atheists, right? The angry people with the keyboards. However, it is actually a very real thing even today. Just a couple weeks ago, I talked to a girl in the youth group. I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but her brother is having a hard time reconciling that God can exist and bullies that bully him at school exist. He's like, oh, it just can't be. Because on a very rudimentary level, on a very fundamental level, people haven't wrestled with these concepts. The church has done a pretty poor job at dealing with these concepts. And then what ends up happening is that once they're confronted with evil and suffering, they go, well, how can God be good? Because they blame all the evil on the world on God, right? And especially because we come from Protestant backgrounds, really, we all do. Like, essentially, if you're evangelical, you have a Protestant backing. You come from a worldview or a doctrinal teaching that teaches that all things happen by the will of God, right? God has a plan. I actually saw this I saw it yesterday. There was a guy I know, a great youth pastor, great guy, very firmly based on Scripture, and he quit his pastorate because of the corruption he was dealing with. And he was like, hey, I'm just done. I'd rather be a tent maker and not have to deal with some of this stuff and still minister than to be a full-time ministry and deal with a lot of the garbage that can come with it. And people in the comment section were going, God has a plan, just don't worry about it. God has a plan. And I was like, okay, God has a plan, but it's not. But you're making it out like God willed that evil, so that way His plan could be, brought to fruition. Or they have also said like, that's all. Oh, well, this is just God's will. God's will be done. And you're like, okay, but we see specifically in Scripture that God's will isn't always done. People do things against God's will all the time, right? So when you come from this, can you see why that even though now that you, and hopefully maybe before I walked through this, but now especially that we've walked through this, can you see how people get there though? Because of suffering, God can't exist. Now that you have theodicies and all these things, you go, well, that doesn't follow. But you can see where it can really trip up people, especially young people today, and especially young people today in a church world that's, let's just be honest, pretty uneducated. We have big hearts in our world, right? We like to do our praise and worship. There's always big productions. You get a nice 20-minute feel-good sermon maybe, but not a strong education on how to deal with some of these real-world issues. I'm kind of more preaching here than anything, but do you guys see how that happens? Okay? So one of my biggest issues in general, a lot of churches where the pastors aren't concerned with equipping people, which is why I'm very thankful that Frontline is concerned about equipping people, and they're like, well, okay, no, we want a class for this. But that's not the case in most churches today. And that should be something that's very telling to us. So anyway, rant over. So why do people still use this argument, do you guys think? Why do you think people still use this argument if it's so quickly, like all you have to do is issue a defeater and it just collapses under itself? Why do you think people still use it? Anyone?
It's pretty simple to express.
Yeah, no, there's a simplicity to it, yeah.
And it also tugs on the heartstrings a lot. That how can X example that's terrible, everyone would say, oh my goodness, that's such a terrible thing exist, and a good God.
Mm-hmm.
So it gets the emotions going a lot, I think.
Right, exactly. Now you always pick out like the worst thing on planet Earth, right? The most horrible situation. Like, where was your God in that, right? And you're like, okay, I'm not saying that's okay, but it's the way that that view of God wills everything. So where was your God in that? And if He didn't will it, then why was He complacent in it? If He was so powerful. But we've already looked at that. If God does that, He's the helicopter parent, right? Then you don't really have a free will because He's continually, oh no, I can't allow that, I can't allow that. So then the freedom He gave man, He then takes it away. Therefore He goes back on His promise, right? So, and that is one of the things you have to think about. If God gave you freedom, think about, let's actually take a moment to think about that. What would your world be if you didn't have true freedom? Think about that. If all you had was good, like you had no freedom, do you even know what that existence would even be like? Think about that for a minute. That wouldn't even be the human experience, right? Half of your day is making those free decisions, right, on what is right, what is wrong, what is wise, what is unwise, how do I interact with these people. These are all part of your experience, and if we remove that, what would your existence even be? It would be unrecognizable, right? You wouldn't even know, because it's funny, if people are like, well, it would be better. I'm like, would it? Because you don't know what that existence is like, because you have that freedom, right? So again, we're making assumptions here. So if you're asking God to remove all those things, always interject when evil happens, you're asking to remove all freedom, essentially. Because freedom is always between better or worse response, essentially, right? So anyway. So because people become, and Seth, you were kind of onto it there. One of the reasons why I think many people still use the logical argument from evil nowadays, one, I think is because people are not educated in logic and philosophy at all, right? There's like no logic and philosophy taught today. Actually, can we please bring that back in schools, like a logic class? I think that'd save a lot of problems nowadays. Men cannot be women. All right, so let's just start there. But people become atheists due to moral or immoral reasons usually. Now, sometimes there's evidence, right? They find something in the Bible. They go, I don't know if I can reconcile this. I don't see evidence for this, and then they slowly fall away from the faith, right? So some people it's evidential. A lot of other people I've noticed that's a lot of reasons due to moral or immoral issues, right? So those are usually the two big ones. I have a reason to doubt, and what I've seen in the apologetics world, there was actually, what's his name? He's an apologist. He got some heat for it recently. He told people if you're struggling with your faith, turn off atheist channels. And because what will happen is that you'll have somebody who is ill-equipped, knows very little about apologetics or the reasons to defend their faith, right? They know this much. They might know something can't come from nothing, right? There's that, and I love Jesus. Like that, their apologetic is very low. So what happens is they go, well, I want to hear what the other side has to say, while they're equipped with like a BB gun, and they go in and they start facing cannons, and then they wonder why their faith is struggling. Well, it's because you never got equipped with our side first before you jumped into the battlefield. Does that make sense? So that happens all the time. So, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen that. So that's why like some of the Christian apologists are like, turn off the atheist channels for a minute. If you really want to defend the faith, then you need to start studying the experts on our side first. And especially when you're dealing with such a big issue such as faith. Because if God is not real, that has huge life impact, right? So if God's not real, you'd think you'd want to at least hear all the arguments as to why he is real before you go, well, maybe he's not. Let me see what the other side has to say. And I think that's a thing in general. You should always be educated on your side of things quite a bit before you start hearing counter arguments, right? And then just see how they all weigh out.
But some people don't want to turn off the news totally. I have. But
Right.
I'm tired.
Well, I'm just tired. But you're right. But some people's like, they get this weird charge out of it, and also so anyway, that's a huge issue. So, but a lot of them, so some of them just fall apart because they haven't had good reasons, and then they start hearing opposite reasons, and the reasons that they were given originally to believe don't hold up very well, so then they just fall apart. This is why people still use this logical argument today, because a lot of them fall apart due to moral failings. Another popular apologist, and in the academic world is funny because Frank Turek has like a love-hate relationship in the academic world. Some people love him, some people hate him. I actually like Frank Turek because I feel like he's the everyday guy, the everyday apologist. If you guys haven't, there's a good book that's a great introductory book for apologetics. It's called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. It's a really good introductory book. It gives like an overview of a general apologetic, and then you can get more technical later, but like it allows you to do that. But Frank Turek actually once had a young man who asked him, a young man that came up at one of his lectures and said that he no longer believed in God. And Frank and him discussed back and forth for a minute, and then he goes, and the boy's girlfriend was there, and he just says, "You're sleeping with your girlfriend, aren't you?" Just hits him like that, right in the front of everybody, which is like, I mean, most of us would be like, wow, that's a really mean pastor, right? That's not nice. But he goes, "You're sleeping with your girlfriend, aren't you?" And she was obviously sheepishly kind of standing behind him. And by the way, that's a very bold move, all right? That's a very bold move, Cotton. But he proceeded, this kid starts to break down and cry, and he admitted that he was. And Frank pointed out, and he said that you didn't leave the faith because he thought the evidence against God's existence was good. He left the faith because he wanted to go engage in something that he knew would have been immoral with his God, with his belief in God. So he ditched the belief in God so he could do what he wanted. And the kid basically admitted it. That's essentially what happened. So, and nowadays it's funny because I'm in the apologetic sphere and I'm an evidentialist, so I hear regularly, well, no, a lot of people leave because of a lack of evidence, which is true, that because they haven't been taught evidence. But there's also people who very much leave because of emotional reasons. So therefore, if God doesn't exist, if evil exists, God can't exist. I just don't need to think about it any further. Just abandon God and just do what I want to do. Okay, and you can see how one follows the other. So this argument, so honestly, the logical argument from evil should just be dead. It really should just be dead, like because it philosophically, logically, does not follow. But unfortunately, it's very alive and well today in young people, and also in the new atheist movement. Have you guys heard of the neo-atheists or the new atheists? They're people like Matt Dillahunty, Sam Harris, who I've referenced in here, and they're the ones who are academic of some sort, and they still postulate some of this argumentation. There's actually a great debate. I really wish we had more time sometimes in here, because I'd love to one time just be like, all right, for class today, we're just going to watch this debate and notice a few things, but the debates are always too long. But there's a great debate with Dr. Braxton Hunter and Matt Dillahunty to check out. But anyway, so being able to respond to this sort of argument anyway gives people permission to believe in God. And I think that's one of the things that we need to remember that we're doing here. This isn't so you can put on your boxing gloves, go find that atheist kid who drives you nuts at work or school, and beat him in the face with logics and facts and just walk away strutting, feeling good about yourself, like, yeah, showed him, all right. That's not the point of this. The point of this is to take the objections that they think hold up against God and slowly knock them down to be able to give them permission to believe in God, because they've only been taught that idiots believe in God. Okay? So you want to show them that such a belief does not follow. Okay? And that's the point. And now I will say this, the evidential argument from evil that we're going to observe next week is bigger in the academic sphere, but in your everyday life, you're probably going to run into the logical argument from evil. Does that make sense? Even the logical argument is the one that doesn't hold up.
So do you think if like pressed on the logical argument, people will then try to switch to the evidential argument?
Sometimes.
Of like, well, there's so much evil.
Right. You'll hear that, well, there is so much evil, so God can't exist. But then that's when you would just ask someone at what point, what level of evil, right? But they're just trying to say that doesn't follow, that is incoherent. So most of the time, people you're going to run into, like everyday people, that's what they'll fall into. Andrew and I were talking about that yesterday, actually, on our way to New Salem. But we were talking about how it's funny how a lot of these people have these beliefs, and the moment you mention a couple counters, it can get very quiet, and you can start noticing that they've never thought about it before that way. It's just kind of like remember that we had that pro-life series? A lot of people just haven't thought about it that deeply. And so as soon as you start just kind of poking little holes in it, it makes them go, oh. Greg Kaukel, if you guys were in this class when I first started the apologetics, and I did like the very classical arguments for God, one of the things that Greg Kaukel says is putting a pebble in the shoe. Yeah. Sometimes that's all you have to do, and sometimes that's all you have the opportunity to do, is put a pebble in the shoe. And we've all had a pebble in the shoe, right? Where you walk around, you're like, God's driving me crazy. You eventually have to rip it out and just dump it out. That's kind of what you want to do with somebody logically and philosophically about the existence of God. Sometimes you don't have time to sit down with somebody for 3 hours and really just get into the weeds of it. So sometimes you might just need to drop a little pebble in the shoe, so that way they go home and they're like, yeah, what? How do I make sense of that? Andrew?
Well, that's what we're talking about, because we care about people so much, and we don't want them to spend an eternity without God. And that's one of the things as a Christian that should really concern us. But with that, we have to realize too that we don't save anybody. We do the very human best that we can, and God will meet us halfway and also help plant that seed. And the Holy Spirit is the one who convicts and guides them to salvation.
Right, and the only thing that you can do is be best equipped to be able to respond. Yeah. And because I'm of the belief that if somebody's truly open-minded, if you present them with evidence enough, they will convert. If somebody's closed-minded, no matter how much evidence you present to them, they won't convert. We've all run into, actually, if anyone's had children, I'm sure you're very well aware of what that's like, where it's like, I have you dead to rights, I am 1000% correct, but you're still being rebellious. How many of you guys have experienced that before, right?
I've seen it. Yeah.
What?
I've seen it.
Right, and yeah, exactly, you've seen it, where it's like, no matter what, they're just got their heels dug in. Some people are like that, but that's where you just do the pebble in the shoe and walk away, right? So anyway, this is just a logical argument from evil. It's not a complex view. All you have to do is bring up a defeater and you can see that it falls apart on itself. Because to say that God and evil can't exist doesn't follow. So does anyone have comments on that? Because it's a shorter class with that, because it's pretty quick now that we've dismantled everything. No commentary? Nothing? So, again, just as a reminder, logical argument from evil attempts to show that it is improbable that God exists. It's not. Attempts to show that it is improbable that God exists. It is not. That's the idea. I was like, what? Why am I saying that? It attempts to show that it is not improbable that God exists. I have a typo. It is attempting to show that it is not logically possible that God exists as he is defined. So, and all you have to do is, again, bring up a possibility as to why evil would exist and God exists, and then the claim falls apart. So yeah, and next week we're going to look at the evidential argument from evil. Now next week I want you to bring your thinking caps, because next week we're actually going to get into it a little bit deeper.